Somewhere in California right now, there's a law on the books that was written to force Linux, the free operating system running most of the internet, to ask you your birthday before you could even turn on a new computer. Not Windows, not your phone. Linux, the software with no company behind it, no headquarters, no CEO you could drag in front of a legislature, built for free by volunteers, scattered across 90 countries who mostly do it for fun. And in late 2025, a California lawmaker tried to make every single one of them build a surveillance checkpoint into their code, or face the consequences. What happened next is one of the strangest, most satisfying legislative collisions in recent memory, because within months, the exact same politician who wrote that law was forced to publicly rewrite it. And the story of how that happened tells you something much bigger about who actually holds power over the internet in 2026. Before we get into the fight itself, you need to understand what almost got swallowed whole, because most people using the internet right now have no idea how much of it is quietly built on this one piece of software. Linux is not some niche hobbyist toy running in a teenager's bedroom. It is the operating system underneath the majority of the world's web servers. It is the backbone of most cloud computing infrastructure. The exact servers your banking app, your streaming service, and your phone's cloud backup all depend on every single day. It is the foundation Android is built on, which means it is sitting inside billions of phones right now, in every pocket, on every continent. Hospitals run on it, universities run on it, stock exchanges run on it, and almost none of the people relying on it have ever typed the word Linux into a search bar. So when California decided to write a law aimed squarely at this piece of software, it was never a fringe policy footnote. It was a law that could have reached into nearly every corner of modern digital life without most of the public ever realizing the collision was happening. Here's how it started, quietly, the way most legislation does, buried in language that sounded reasonable on the surface. In late 2025, California passed Assembly Bill 1043, the Digital Age Assurance Act. The stated goal was simple enough to win broad public sympathy instantly: protect children online. Instead of relying on individual apps and websites to verify a user's age, something that had failed for years, reduced to nothing more than a checkbox any 10-year-old could click past in 2 seconds, lawmakers wanted to push that responsibility down to the operating system itself. Every device, right at setup, would ask for your birth date, sort you into an age bracket, and quietly broadcast that bracket to every app you installed afterward. On paper, it sounds like a clean fix to a real problem. In practice, it was about to run headfirst into a piece of software that was never built to take orders from anyone. Picture the moment this law actually meets reality. You unbox a new laptop. You install Ubuntu or Fedora or Debian, one of the free operating systems millions of people around the world choose, specifically because nobody is tracking them, nobody's harvesting their data, nobody's asking permission to exist online. Under California's new law, before you could do anything else, that machine would be legally required to ask your age and hand that information off to every piece of software that touched it afterward. Now here's the part California's lawmakers apparently never fully worked through before they passed this thing. Who exactly were they expecting to build that? Because Linux is not a company. There is no Linux Inc., no headquarters, no general counsel's office you can send a compliance letter to. Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, Arch, Mint, and hundreds of smaller distributions are separate, independently run projects, many staffed entirely by unpaid volunteers building software in their evenings because they love doing it, not because anyone is paying them to satisfy a state mandate. And it gets stranger because Linux is what developers call infinitely forkable. Anyone on Earth can take the source code, modify it, and release their own version tomorrow. There is no gatekeeper. No single choke point where California could stand and say, comply or else. There isn't one ecosystem to regulate. There are millions of independently distributed copies of this software, endlessly rebuilt by people the state has no way of even identifying, let alone finding. Try to picture the scale of that mismatch for a second. Imagine passing a law that tried to regulate every single meal ever cooked from one particular cookbook, except that cookbook has been photocopied, translated, remixed, and handed out for free by millions of independent cooks over 3 decades. And every one of them is free to swap out any ingredient they like and pass their version along to someone else. You cannot subpoena the cookbook. There's no one person responsible for what happens in every kitchen it ever touched. That is roughly the wall Sacramento walked into. Except instead of recipes, this was the software quietly running underneath a meaningful share of the servers, phones, and laptops on the planet. And the deeper you look, the messier it gets, because this wasn't just impractical, it was legally radioactive. Linux software is distributed under open source licenses, and many of those licenses, including the GPL, one of the most widely used in the world, explicitly forbid anyone from adding what's called a further restriction on the people receiving the software. Legal. Experts started raising their hands almost immediately once the bill's language became public, pointing out that a government-mandated age checkpoint baked directly into the operating system might itself count as exactly that kind of forbidden restriction. Which means California may have accidentally written a law that Linux legally could not comply with, not because developers refused, but because obeying the state might have required breaking the very license the software was built on in the first place. Sit with that for a second, because it is a genuinely rare kind of legal trap. Follow California's law, and you might be violating the open source license your software runs under, opening yourself up to an entirely separate lawsuit. Follow the license instead, and you're exposed to civil penalties under state statute. For a stretch of months, there was no clean way to satisfy both at once. A law built to protect children had accidentally manufactured a lose-lose scenario for the very people building the software. Those children, and everyone else, actually use every day. And nobody in Sacramento had a clear answer for the next obvious question. If a distribution failed to comply, who exactly would be held responsible? The volunteer, who maintains the text editor bundled into the installer? The kernel developer, who patched an unrelated bug last month? The person who wrote the setup documentation? Linux is built by thousands of scattered, mostly unpaid contributors. The bill offered no answer for who, in that sprawling structure, was supposed to be the one facing consequences. Comparable legislation in other states has attached civil fines running as high as $7,500 per violation, a number that becomes almost darkly funny once you try to picture which unpaid volunteer maintaining some obscure package nobody's heard of was supposed to be the one writing that check. And once that uncertainty set in, a quieter, colder calculation started spreading through developer circles. If nobody could say clearly who was liable, the safest move wasn't attempting compliance at all. It was avoiding the state entirely. Some legal advisors began floating the idea of simply geo-blocking California, the fifth largest economy on Earth, from accessing open-source code repositories, rather than risk an undefined, potentially unlimited legal exposure. Think about how strange that outcome is for a law that was supposed to be about protecting kids. The practical effect, if left unchecked, might have been developers walling off an entire state from free software, fragmenting the internet itself along a border nobody asked for, and making the software worse for absolutely everyone, including the children the law claimed to be protecting. Then SteamOS entered the picture, and the entire situation got even messier. Valve's gaming platform sits in a strange middle ground. Open source Linux underneath, but wrapped around Valve's own proprietary storefront and account system, the exact kind of centralized commercial ecosystem the law was originally aimed at in the first place, which meant that even as pure volunteer-run distributions like Debian and Fedora looked increasingly likely to slip outside the law's reach, a platform millions of actual people used every single day to play video games remained stuck directly in the crosshairs. Nobody involved could draw a clean legal line because SteamOS was deliberately built to blur that exact line. Open at its foundation, commercial at its surface, and any attempt to carve out an exemption for one risked either exempting the other by accident or dragging it back into scope entirely. Now, here's where the story stops being a niche developer complaint and turns into a real mainstream fight, because it did not stay contained to forums and mailing lists. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, one of the most respected digital rights organizations in the country, came out publicly against the bill, warning that forcing an operating system to sort every user into an age bracket doesn't just protect children. It builds the exact infrastructure a much larger identity tracking system would need later. Once a system exists that can reliably report your age category to any app that asks, very little additional engineering stands between that and a system reporting far more sensitive information to far more interested parties, for far less sympathetic reasons. That is not paranoia. It is a pattern privacy researchers have documented again and again, infrastructure built for one narrow sympathetic purpose, quietly becoming the foundation for something much bigger, simply because the plumbing already exists, and building on top of it is so much easier than building it fresh. Developers, for their part, responded with a mix of dark humor and outright defiance. At Fedora, one of the most widely used distributions in the world, the project leader floated a workaround. A simple file added to the existing permission system, letting users self-declare an age bracket, essentially an honor system drop-down box, standing in for actual verification. It was less a real compliance solution than a technically minimal, almost sarcastic wink at the letter of the law, while making it very clear nobody intended to enforce the spirit of it. Ubuntu's team, meanwhile, spent months quietly consulting lawyers instead of writing a single line of code, unwilling to build anything until the legal questions got answered. Other corners of the community skipped diplomacy entirely, openly discussing plans to just ignore the statute outright or block California IP addresses from their repositories altogether rather than risk any exposure at all. One niche operating system project went further still, shipping an update with what it called an age attestation background process, something that ran automatically at startup unless a user dug into a configuration file and manually switched it off. Most people would never even know it existed. It wasn't really compliance, it was commentary. A pointed demonstration of exactly how hollow a check-the-box law like this would end up being in the real world. And here's the detail that makes this whole story land differently, because California was not actually first, and California was not actually alone. Colorado had introduced comparable legislation of its own, and in that state, something very different happened before the bill ever became law. A Linux hardware company's CEO personally sat down with the bill's co-author, walked through the technical realities of open source software line by line, and proposed the exact kind of exemption California would later be dragged into adopting only after months of public fighting. The senator responded openly, signaling a willingness to amend the bill before it ever caused a problem. That meeting planted an idea directly inside a state legislature that open source software occupies a fundamentally different category than commercial platforms and cannot be regulated the same way. It is worth sitting with how different that path was. Colorado consulted the experts before the ink dried. California passed the law first and only started listening once the backlash made ignoring it politically expensive. And that expertise wasn't hard to find. Open source foundations, Linux vendors, and privacy researchers had all tried to raise these exact warnings while California's bill was still being drafted. The problem was never a lack of available knowledge. It was a failure to seek it out, or a decision that the political upside of looking tough on child safety outweighed the harder, slower, far less visible work of getting the technical details right the first time. Which brings us to the moment that makes this entire story worth telling, the part that is genuinely rare to watch play out this visibly. In February of 2026, the very same lawmaker who wrote the original bill, Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, introduced Assembly Bill 1856, an amendment specifically designed to carve open source software out of her own earlier law. The amendment redefined what counts as an operating system provider under California statute, explicitly excluding anyone distributing software under a license that lets users copy, modify, and redistribute it freely. In plain terms, that carve-out effectively protects Linux, and only Linux, among the operating systems people actually use every day. Read that again, because it is easy to blow past how unusual this actually is. This wasn't a court striking the law down. This wasn't a rival politician introducing competing legislation to block it. This was the original author publicly formally rewriting her own bill in direct response to the very backlash her first version created. That is about as close to a public admission of a legislative miscalculation as you will ever see from an elected official defending her own signature law. And it didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without a fight. The amendment moved slowly through committee across the spring of 2026, gathering a handful of formal supporters and a smaller but vocal group of formal opponents at every stage, a genuinely contested process that only succeeded because the pressure behind it, technical, legal, and political all at once, stayed sustained long enough to survive multiple rounds of scrutiny instead of fading out after the first wave of headlines. That pressure came from developers explaining, in exhausting technical detail, exactly why the law as written could never function. It came from privacy organizations warning about the surveillance infrastructure being normalized under the cover of a child protection. It came from legal experts flagging a direct, unavoidable conflict with the open source licenses the entire ecosystem runs on. And it came from ordinary users, the people who actually run this software every single day, making enough noise across forums, mailing lists, and eventually mainstream tech coverage that the story became impossible for Sacramento to simply wait out. That specific combination, precise technical criticism from people who actually understood what was broken, paired with public pressure loud enough to be politically costly to ignore, is exactly the kind of pairing that moves legislation far more reliably than outrage on its own ever manages to. But before you file this away as a clean, simple victory, understand what this amendment does not do, because the real story is more complicated than that. AB 1856 does not repeal the Digital Age Assurance Act. The core law is still fully in effect, still scheduled to take hold on January 1st, 2027. Windows and macOS remain completely subject to its age verification requirements, with no exemption anywhere in sight for either of them. And the amendment does something that got almost no attention next to the Linux exemption. It actually expands the law's reach in the opposite direction, extending its requirements to browsers and website operators, while requiring any operating system vendor, still covered by the statute, to transmit only the minimum age information necessary to comply. In other words, California did not abandon what it was trying to build and narrowed who has to construct the surveillance infrastructure while simultaneously widening where the infrastructure has to exist. That detail matters because it complicates any version of this story that frames it as a clean win against government overreach. A commercial browser vendor, unlike a volunteer-run Linux project, does have a company behind it, a legal department, existing user data infrastructure, an actual entity that can be summoned, fined, or sued, which means the exemption Linux just won may end up being less a retreat from the law's ambitions and more a redirection of them toward targets the state now believes it can actually enforce this against successfully. And that is the detail that should stay with you longer than any single provision in this bill, because this entire episode is a small, remarkably clean case study in a much larger collision that is only going to keep happening as more governments try to regulate the internet directly. Lawmakers want tools to protect children online, and that instinct isn't unreasonable on its face. But the internet those lawmakers are trying to regulate was never built the way commercial software is built. Enormous stretches of it are decentralized, volunteer-run, endlessly forkable, structurally incapable of being controlled the way a single company with a legal department and a compliance budget can be controlled. Write a law assuming every operating system looks like Windows or iOS, something with a company behind it you can call, fine, or sue, and you will eventually discover that some of the most widely used software on the planet simply does not work that way and was never designed to. This same collision has already surfaced trying to apply data protection law to decentralized cryptocurrency networks and content moderation rules to federated social platforms with no single company steering the ship. Every time, the same pattern repeats. A law gets written with a centralized corporate target in mind and quietly discovers that a meaningful share of the technology it was meant to govern has no target there to hold accountable at all. California's collision with Linux is simply the loudest, most public version of that pattern to date. Precisely because Linux operates at such enormous, invisible scale that the mismatch between the law and the software became impossible to quietly paper over and forget. And there will absolutely be a next version of this fight. Colorado is already moving similar legislation forward, with an effective date set for January of 2028, built on largely the same structural blueprint California started with. Other states are watching closely, waiting to see exactly how this conflict resolves before deciding how to write their own versions. The lesson California just taught the rest of the country, whether it meant to or not, is that open source software sits in a genuinely different legal and technical category than commercial platforms, one that lawmakers ignore at the risk of writing something unenforceable, legally self-contradictory, or both, the moment it collides with the actual architecture of the software it was trying to control. Whether other states actually absorb that lesson before writing their own versions remains an open question. Legislative bodies don't always learn efficiently from each other's mistakes. And the political incentive to look tough on child safety often outweighs the slower, more cautious, technically informed process that might prevent a repeat of California's stumble. Some states may sit down with open source communities early, the way Colorado did in that first quiet meeting. Others may simply pass a broad law, trigger an identical backlash, and eventually land on a similarly narrow carve-out, running through the exact same expensive months-long cycle California just survived. Either way, the deeper structural tension between centralized regulation and decentralized software isn't going anywhere. If anything, it is only going to keep resurfacing as more governments try to put their hands on this exact corner of the internet. So here is the question worth sitting with after everything you just heard, the one this story only partially answers. If a decentralized, volunteer-run piece of software, with no company behind it, no legal department, no single point anyone could sue, can generate enough organized public pressure to force a sitting lawmaker to publicly rewrite her own bill within a matter of months. What does that actually say about the leverage ordinary, well-organized technical communities still hold over the laws written about the tools they build and use every single day? California wrote a rule for an internet that, in large part, no longer answers to any single company, government, or point of control. And for at least one law, in at least one state, that internet just proved it could still push back hard enough to win. But that leverage is not a guarantee, and it will not repeat itself automatically. It worked here because the mismatch between the law and the software was severe enough and public enough to pull developers, privacy organizations, and eventually mainstream press coverage into the same fight at the same time. The next collision might involve a subtler flaw, a smaller community or far less press coverage to carry the backlash as far as it needs to go. This particular battle went in Linux's favor. The next one is not guaranteed to.